There is a building in Prague that does not appear on any map. It stands on a narrow street between a bookshop and a bakery, 3 stories of grey stone with windows that reflect a sky slightly different from the one above the neighbouring rooftops. The door is always unlocked. The sign above it, carved in letters that seem to shift between languages depending on who is reading them, says simply, Museum. Dr. Thomas Ashworth found it on a Tuesday afternoon in October, while lost in the old town after a conference on theoretical physics that had left him restless and dissatisfied. He was 54, a professor of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, and he had spent the last 3 decades working on a unified theory of temporal mechanics that no one believed in and that he was beginning to doubt himself. The building caught his eye because it shouldn't have been there. He had walked this street before, many times during previous visits to Prague, and there had never been anything between the bookshop and the bakery but a wall. The lobby was small, wood-panelled, and lit by lamps that burned with a light Thomas couldn't identify. Not electric, not gas, not flame. Something else, something that cast no shadows. A reception desk stood against the far wall, and behind it, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s or her 70s, or somehow both at once. She had dark hair streaked with silver and eyes that were brown in one light and green in another. She smiled when Thomas entered, as if she had been expecting him. "Welcome to the Museum of Lost Tomorrows," she said. Her accent was unplaceable. "We collect futures that never happened, timelines that branched and withered, possibilities that were real briefly before collapsing back into potential." Thomas, who had spent 30 years studying the theoretical possibility of branching timelines, felt the hair on his arms rise. "That's not possible," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," she agreed, "and yet here we are." The first gallery was called the Hall of Small Divergences. It was a long room with display cases on either side, each containing what appeared to be ordinary objects: a bus ticket, a wedding ring, a letter, a set of keys, a child's drawing. But each object was accompanied by a small plaque that described the future it represented. A bus ticket from Manchester, dated June 15th, 1983. In one timeline, a woman named Sarah Chen caught this bus and met her future husband in the seat next to her. They married, had 3 children, and one of those children grew up to develop a treatment for a rare genetic disorder that affected 12,000 people worldwide. In another timeline, Sarah missed the bus by 30 seconds. She met someone else, lived a different life, equally valid, equally real, but the treatment for the genetic disorder was never developed in that timeline. Both futures were real. Both existed. One happened, and one came here to the Museum of Lost Tomorrows, preserved in a bus ticket behind glass. Thomas moved through the gallery slowly, reading every plaque, his physicist's mind racing to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew about the universe. The objects were real. He could feel it, not in any scientific sense, but in the way that a person who has spent their life studying the structure of reality develops an instinct for when something is genuinely strange rather than merely unusual. The museum was not a trick or a thought experiment. It was exactly what it claimed to be: a repository of lost timelines, made physical and tangible through means that Thomas's 30 years of theoretical work had not even begun to approach. He stood in the center of the gallery and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a young graduate student first encountering quantum mechanics. Awe, the pure, humbling awe of confronting something that was both completely impossible and undeniably true. The second gallery was larger, much larger. The ceiling rose to heights that the building's exterior could not possibly contain, and the exhibits were not objects behind glass but entire rooms, sealed behind transparent walls, each containing a frozen moment from a timeline that had diverged catastrophically from the one Thomas knew. In one room, he saw a version of London that had never been bombed in the Second World War, its Victorian architecture intact and gleaming, airships docking at crystal towers that rose above the Thames. In another, he saw a Mars colony, established in 1992, its domed cities red against the dusty landscape. In a third, he saw a version of Earth where the dinosaurs had never gone extinct, and a civilization of intelligent raptors had developed mathematics, art, and a form of music that used subsonic frequencies humans couldn't hear. Each room was complete, detailed, and absolutely convincing. Each represented a world that had been possible briefly before the timeline collapsed and left only the one reality that Thomas inhabited. The curator, if that was what she was, found Thomas sitting on a bench in the Hall of Great Divergences, staring at a frozen moment from a timeline where humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel in 2019. "There is one more gallery," she said. "It is optional. Many visitors choose not to enter." She led him to a door at the end of a corridor that seemed to grow longer as they walked. The door was plain, unmarked, and when Thomas touched the handle, it was warm, almost alive. "This is the personal gallery," the curator said. "Every visitor's personal gallery is different. It shows the lost futures of your own life, the choices you didn't make, the paths you didn't take, the person you might have been." She paused. "I should warn you, most people find this room more difficult than the others. It is one thing to see a world where the dinosaurs survived. It is another to see a world where you married the person you let go, or took the job you turned down, or said the words you never said." Thomas's hand tightened on the door handle. His mind went immediately to the same place it always went, to the laboratory, to the accident, to the colleague he had failed to warn in time. The room beyond the door contained 5 exhibits, 5 moments from Thomas's life where the timeline had branched and a different future had been possible. The first showed him at 25, accepting a position at CERN instead of Cambridge. In that timeline, he had made a breakthrough in particle physics that led to controllable fusion power by 2010. The second showed him at 32, telling his wife the truth about his fears instead of retreating into his work. In that timeline, they hadn't divorced. The third showed him at 40, publishing a paper on temporal mechanics that he had actually written, but had been too afraid to submit, fearing ridicule. In that timeline, the paper had been recognized as groundbreaking, and the unified theory he had spent decades pursuing had been completed 15 years earlier. The fourth showed him at 47, going back to the laboratory on the day of the accident instead of staying home with a cold. In that timeline, he had noticed the calibration error. He had warned his colleague. She had lived. Thomas stood in front of the fourth exhibit for a very long time. Fifth exhibit was different from the others. The first 4 showed timelines that had already diverged and collapsed. They were fixed, frozen, unreachable. But the fifth room was still moving. Through its transparent wall, Thomas saw himself. Not a past self, but a present self. A Thomas Ashworth who was standing in a room very much like this one, looking at exhibits very much like these. But this other Thomas was smiling. In this timeline, the divergence point was now. Today, this very moment. The exhibit showed what would happen if Thomas left the museum and did one specific thing. The plaque described it in simple terms. In this timeline, Thomas Ashworth returns to Cambridge, retrieves the temporal mechanics paper from his bottom desk drawer, revises it with 30 years of additional insight, and publishes it. The paper is initially ignored. Then a graduate student at MIT reads it and realizes that it contains a mathematical framework that unifies quantum mechanics and general relativity in a way that no one had previously considered. The framework leads within a decade to practical applications that change the world. Not time travel, something stranger, a way of perceiving all possible timelines simultaneously, a way of seeing the full branching tree of possibility that the universe creates at every moment. A museum, Thomas realized. The paper leads to a museum. Thomas turned to the curator. "Is this real?" he asked. "Is this a genuine timeline, or is it something you created to manipulate me into publishing my paper?" The curator's expression was patient and kind and completely unreadable. "Everything in the museum is real," she said. "Every future we display existed as a genuine possibility. We do not create, we collect." She paused. "But I should tell you something about the fifth exhibit. It is the only one in your personal gallery that is still open. The other 4 timelines have collapsed. They are gone forever. The choices that would have led to them can no longer be made. But the 5th timeline is still possible. The paper is still in your drawer. The future it leads to is still available." She looked at him steadily. "It will not remain available forever. Timelines close. Possibilities expire. If you leave the museum and do not publish the paper, the fifth exhibit will freeze, and it will become another lost tomorrow. One more future preserved behind glass, beautiful and complete, and forever unreachable. Thomas looked at the fifth exhibit. He looked at the fourth, where his colleague was alive, and he had made a different choice. He looked at all five and understood, for the first time in his career, what his theoretical work had been trying to tell him all along. The past branches of possibility were closed. The future branches were still open. The only moment that mattered was now. Thomas left the museum. He walked down the narrow Prague street, past the bookshop and the bakery, into the autumn sunlight. When he turned to look back, the building was gone. There was nothing between the bookshop and the bakery but a wall, old and grey, as if nothing had ever been there. He flew back to Cambridge the next morning. He went to his office, opened his bottom desk drawer, and found the paper. It was yellowed with age, the equations written in his younger handwriting, dense and ambitious and flawed in ways he could now see clearly. He sat down and began to revise. The work took 7 months. He incorporated 3 decades of accumulated knowledge, correcting errors, filling gaps, strengthening the mathematical framework until it was solid and complete. He submitted the paper on a Tuesday afternoon, the same day of the week he had found the museum. It was published 4 months later in a journal that almost no one read. For 2 years, nothing happened. Then a graduate student at MIT named Elena Vasquez read the paper while researching an unrelated topic, and she saw what Thomas had seen: the branching, the possibility, the mathematics of all the futures that exist in the spaces between 1 second and the next. She called Thomas on a Thursday evening, and they talked for 3 hours, and by the end of the conversation, Thomas knew that the fifth exhibit had come true. Not because the museum had predicted it, but because he had chosen to make it happen. The past is fixed. The future is not. And somewhere in Prague, on a street that exists only when you need it to, a museum preserves the futures we lose, so that we might better cherish the ones we choose.